to meeting number 14 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence. As you know, this is a hybrid meeting, so there are the same rules apply, and I would, a couple extra reminders. I would ask all of the comments from members be directed towards the chair. And when you're speaking, please speak clearly and slowly. I know sometimes I have trouble with that myself, but I think that would be a great aid to our interpreters. And when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. With regard to a speaking limit, a speaking list, the committee clerk and myself will do our very best to keep track and maintain a consolidated order, whether you're here in person or participating virtually. So, pursuant to Standing Order 1064, the committee is meeting today to consider a request received by the clerk and submitted by 4 members of the committee to discuss their request to undertake a study of allegations of sexual misconduct on the part of retired General Jonathan Vance during and before his tenure as Chief of the Defence Staff of the Canadian Armed Forces. Just for clarification, the meeting today will be restricted to dealing with the topic at hand, which the 4 members of the committee have requested that we discuss. Members have all received the letter and have had a chance to look at the meeting request. I will now open the floor for debate and will first suggest that the motion be read for the record. Who is going to read? Mr. Bazan. I hand over to you, Mr. Bazan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate committee coming together to debate this motion. I would also like to point out that because of the news yesterday that the clerk of the Privy Council, Ian Sugar, is not able to perform his duties right now due to medical leave, and also from other news that has appeared, I'd like to read into record a slightly amended motion. And that motion will be that the Standing Committee on National Defence begin an immediate study into the allegations of sexual misconduct on the part of retired General Jonathan Vance during and before his tenure as Chief of Defence Staff at the Canadian Armed Forces, that at least 5 meetings be held in public for no fewer than 2 hours each, that the meetings take place before February 26, 2021, that the following witnesses be called to testify individually before the committee: the Honourable Harjit Sajjan, Minister of National Defence; the Deputy Clerk of the Privy Council, Christine Tremblay; Deputy Minister of National Defence, Jody Thomas; Zita Astravis, Michael Warnick, and any other witnesses the committee deems necessary, that these meetings be televised and the committee report its findings to the House. So that's the motion, Madam Chair, and if you wish, I would be more than happy to speak to that motion.
Motion in order.
So, Madam Chair, I just would say that the news reports that we have heard over the last number of weeks are disturbing, to say the least. We all believe that members of the Canadian Armed Forces should be able to operate in an environment that is not threatening and free of sexual misconduct. We don't want to, in any way, shape, or form, tarnish the investigation that is ongoing right now with the Canadian Armed Forces into these allegations, but they are serious and they need to be looked at. The thing that is of great concern is that these allegations were presented to the Minister of Defence, Minister Sajjan, and we have not gotten any clear answers from the media reporting to date on how that information was handled. Whether or not the victims had been talked to and approached and counseling services offered. We don't know what evidence was turned over to the Privy Council office. We don't know if Minister Sajjan reported this up his chain of command and gave it to the Prime Minister so that he could seek his advice. We do know that there is a very different approach that was taken with the Governor General and how those allegations were handled with an independent review and a report that was issued. that ultimately led to her resignation. Now, we know that this information has been out there for 3 years, since the beginning of 2018. And I believe that if you look at the record that is out there in the media through multiple media sources, as well as what seems to be a number of contributing witnesses that have testified to the story, there is, I think, a great deal of concern that the Minister of National Defense, who is responsible and has the authority to manage the Chief of Defense Staff and the department, failed to address these allegations properly. We know that through media reporting that it was definitely brought to his attention by the former veteran or National Defense and Canadian Armed Forces Ombudsman Gary Walborn. And so for that reason, we need to have a thorough look to ensure that Mr. Sajjan exercised his authorities in a responsible manner, that he upheld his legislative and parliamentary duties as defined by the National Defense Act, as well as what's defined through parliamentary procedure and ministerial accountability. So we need to hear from him. But in leading up to hearing from the minister, we need to talk to members of the Privy Council, those that were there at the time, like Michael Warnick. We need to talk to his former chief of staff and find out what they knew at that time. So I believe that there's much here that the committee needs to dive into it. That's why we need 5 meetings, but we need to do this in an expeditious manner so that we can get to the bottom of this and ensure that the morale of the Canadian Armed Forces is not damaged any further than what it already is, and that Canadians can have confidence in our Canadian Armed Forces, the Department of National Defense, and in the Minister of National Defense, whoever that might be.
I heard from the clerk that we just got a copy of this revised motion. I'm going, a couple of things. People need to see this. It's a significant rewrite. It's not just the change of date or something. There's significantly more added to it. And I also, so technically it looks like it is in order. Um, I, but the other thing I'm struggling with here is that we have a convention that works in this committee, and that's the committee that's why I ask you to prioritize your witnesses. So, and then we'll do everything we can to get the witnesses that each party decides is a priority for them. I am really loath to start something like horse trading witnesses in a public committee. And having people talk about, well, no, I want this person, I don't want that person for this reason and that. I just don't want to see it happen. And I think that's the reason why we came up with the procedure. And I think it's been working well to have people prioritize the witnesses, and then we get the witnesses that you want. So it doesn't impact anything directly, I suppose. But I think this will make it much more difficult for us to do this job and to actually look into sensitive issues like this one if we insist on naming witnesses in our motion. So just, I mean, it's nothing illegal or whatever, but it's just a caution. So I am actually going to suspend for a couple of minutes to make sure that everyone gets a copy of this revised agenda. Suspend.
Madam Chair, I had my hand up the whole time. And speaking of convention, you know, because the chair is often doing other things, it's up to the clerk to.
Okay, we are reconvening this meeting. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Did you all receive both motions? Yes? Okay, fine. That's what we needed to make sure. Okay, Ms. Vandenbelt, and then
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I also want to thank the other members of the committee for putting this forward as a motion. I think we've all been shocked by the serious allegations, and we all agree that it's important that our committee study this issue. Minister Sajjan takes this extremely seriously, and I have full confidence that he will make himself available to this committee to testify. Of course, it goes without saying, we have to be very careful that nothing that we say, either in our line of questioning or in the committee, could potentially prejudice any ongoing or future investigations, including investigations by the Canadian Forces National Investigation Service and the military police. I actually believe that our committee could have a really important role to play, not just on this issue, but also providing recommendations on how we can improve on the efforts that have already been made in order to make sure that every member of the defense team, every member of the Canadian Armed Forces and DND feels that they can be safe in the workplace. This is something that, as many committee members know, I have been working on for a very long time. The minister is very committed to, and I think the committee has a role to play in that. I also think it's an opportunity to look at the vetting process that the former Chief of Defense Staff underwent during his appointment. The one thing that I would look at is more of a technical thing. I would like to propose two amendments to the new motion that was put today. One amendment would be that I would propose that we change from 5 meetings to 3 meetings. Of course, the committee and the steering committee could always look at this in terms of our ongoing studies, but I think that for the time being, we should have 3 meetings. I note that originally it was even less than that. So, and the other thing that I would share the concern raised by the chair earlier, that it has been convention in this committee and other committees that we don't talk about which witnesses and who's going to propose a witness and start voting one by one on different witnesses during the committee meeting. It's something that traditionally different members have submitted witness names to the chair, and I've noted that the chair has been very fair in making sure that all of the priority witnesses that any of us have submitted have actually been called to testify. So just on a procedural note, I would prefer that it be done that way. Because of that, I would like to amend the motion that it would take out the names of suggested witness names, except for the minister. I think that one is very fair. We can leave that in. I think the minister has indicated that he's always come to this committee when asked, and I have full confidence he will do so again. But in terms of other witness names, I think we should take it out of the motion, and then each member can submit to the chair what witnesses that they wish, because I do note that there may have been other talk of other members wanting to put forth individual names, and I don't think that is the best practice. So I think I'm fully prepared to support the motion with those 2 minor changes, changing 5 days to 3 days and taking out all of the proposed witness names other than Minister Sajjan. Thank you.
go back. Okay, does anyone else want to talk to this amendment? Madame
Chair.
Galland?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And to the point, the reference you made earlier, the change had to be made because, as you know, one of the witnesses has to undergo medical treatment. So it wasn't a matter of horse trading. We're just trying to show some compassion for one of our public servants. And insofar as not naming witnesses, it has been customary for us to do so. So, in keeping with convention, I feel as we did with the different studies, we should continue to identify just to ensure no substitutions are made where it could be important to have the actual person we're asking for.
And Mr. Garrison, please.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. I'm just asking for a procedural clarification. Are we dealing with 1 amendment or 2 amendments here? It's not clear to me what the Parliamentary Secretary was suggesting, and they clearly have different purposes, and I might be inclined to vote differently on the 2 proposals. but it's not clear to me whether this has been put forward as one amendment or not.
Okay, go ahead, Madame Vanderbilt.
Yeah, my intention was to put it forward as one amendment with two parts.
Thank you for the clarification. If that's the case, I'll be voting against the amendment.
Two parts. Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Duceppe, Brunel Duceppe, on the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I was a little bit surprised, like everyone, because last week already we knew what was going to be happening today, and we had discussions among the parties, and now we have this change out of left field. I think that what Anita has just suggested is quite reasonable. I think that 3 meetings would be enough, and I also think that our practice regarding witnesses works quite well, and I don't think we should change it. So I would support Anita's amendments. I think 3 meetings would be good. This is very important. We can add 1 more day. And then obviously we can keep the minister, we can name him as the witness. And that's the reason that we came up with the motion initially, because he's directly involved. I think that that should give us enough time. We will have the minister, and then we will be able to work from there. So I support Anita's proposal.
So anyone else? Okay, I think we can put this amendment. Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
I would just suggest, I'm okay with if we have to change the number of meetings down and determine, put a couple of witnesses together on their own panels. But I think that, we do have specific witnesses that need to be called based upon the stories that have been in the media. If we want to ensure accountability from a ministerial standpoint, we need to hear from these specific witnesses. So, if the parliamentary secretary wishes to split that into 2 different motions, I think we could, and she's not, I see her, not amenable to that. So for that reason, we'll have to vote against, because we do believe that these are the witnesses that are germane to the discussion at hand.
Anyone else want to speak to the amendment? Go ahead, Madame Galland.
Madam Chair, what we're trying to do here is ensure that the women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces have the confidence that the system that has been put in place to ensure that they are given fairness when they bring forth a complaint of this nature is going to be handled in the proper way. And that is what we're trying to determine here, that the system in place and the process necessary actually occurs. That is why the specific witnesses have been requested. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Very much. Anyone else then who wishes to speak on the amendment? Not seeing anyone. Let's.
I'll move a sub amendment to the amendment, and that is that we do split this into 2 separate votes. One on the 3 meetings, and delete Ms. Vanderbilt's second part, which is to vote on the witness list that is in there.
I don't think we can amend an amendment. I think we have to vote on the amendment as it's come forward. I mean, if you want to put together a separate suggestion, amendment after.
Let's see what happens.
Okay.
Sub-amendments are allowed. They are perfectly legal and have been used before.
to a point, but it's getting a little bit complicated here now, and I think I want everyone to be perfectly clear about what they're voting on.
So if I may,
Okay, go ahead.
Sub-amendments are permitted. This sub-amendment is out of order.
Okay, thank you. All right. All right, so then not having any further, I think it's time to go for a vote on this sub-amendment. Okay, are we ready? Anybody need a refresher? I see a couple of quizzical.
Madam Chair, would you be able to just read that sub-amendment or read the amendment to the motion?
Sure, go ahead.
Amendment.
The amendment. Yes.
The text of the amendment is the following: that the Standing Committee on National Defense begin an immediate study into the allegation of sexual misconduct on the part of retired General Jonathan Vance during and before his tenure as Chief of Defense Staff of the Canadian Armed Forces, that 3 meetings be held in public for no fewer than 2 hours each, that the meetings take place before February 26, 2021, that the following witnesses be called to testify individually before the committee: Honorable Arjit Sajjan, Minister of National Defense, and any other witnesses the committee deems necessary, that these meetings be televised, and that the committee report its findings to the House.
All right then. We're all good? So all, you ready? Okay. 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 So we'll do all those in favor.
Unless
Okay. All right. Copy that. I'm going to hand it over to the clerk now to do a recorded division on that amendment.
the question is on the amendment. Mr. Bagnall,
In favor?
Mr. Baker,
En faveur.
Madame Lalonde,
Pour l'amendement.
Mr. Spanchman,
En faveur, Monsieur le Greffier.
Ms. Vanden Belt,
In favor.
Mr. Benson.
Oppose.
Mr. Bizan,
Opposed.
Mr. Dowdell,
Against.
Ms. Gallant, Monsieur Brunel Duceppe,
Pour la motion.
Mr. Garrison.
Against the amendment.
Yes, so it passes.
Yes.
Was opposed. Okay, it looks like the amendment carries. Okay, so then now we can go back. Go ahead, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. On the main motion, I do want to speak at this point. I think it's very clear that the issue we have before us today really is whether Canadian women can serve equally in the Canadian Armed Forces. And this is a crucial matter for those who are serving and for those who may wish to serve. It's also crucial to the future of the Canadian Forces in that it's no longer in dispute. We know that a more diverse military is a more resilient and more capable military. So this is a question we have to answer both for individuals who might be subject to sexual misconduct and let's be honest, almost all the time that is women. And second, to the future of the Canadian military. So the question of whether adequate efforts have been made to stem sexual harassment and sexual assault in the military is an important question, but one that we already know the answer to. Progress has stalled at what can only be said at its most charitable, very low levels of progress. So much so that last October, the Canadian Forces had to issue a new plan for dealing with sexual misconduct in the military. And I want to just read a quote that accompanied the release of that plan. It said, quote, "To achieve our goal, we must cultivate a command climate across the institution where sexual misconduct is never minimized, ignored, or excused." That, to me, is the question that's in front of the committee today, is making sure that we never ignore, minimize, or excuse that sexual misconduct. The problem is those words from that release came from the Chief of Defense Staff, who now stands accused on multiple occasions of the actual or the very sexual misconduct we're trying to combat. So I do support this motion, not in the sense that the committee should conduct an investigation into the conduct of retired General Vance. Clearly, that's already being undertaken in an appropriate forum. But we do have two responsibilities here as a committee. One of those we've taken on many times and we will take on again, including in our upcoming study on military justice. And that's to make sure the policy and programs are in place that will ensure that sexual harassment and sexual assault are taken seriously, they're dealt with justly, and that services and support are provided to victims in an appropriate manner. But the second responsibility is the one I think this motion deals with, and I think it's urgent that we do undertake this study. And that is that, as the former Chief of Defense Staff said, we can never minimize, ignore, or excuse sexual misconduct. So we need to hear from the Minister of Defense and the Prime Minister about how they dealt with the accusations against General Vance. On the face of it, I don't think anyone would conclude that the actions met that high standard that we need to meet for the Canadian Forces. But there's a second piece of this I think we also need to look at, and that's we need to know whether we've in fact had a failure of two successive governments to deal with the question of sexual misconduct and sexual harassment in the military. And for that reason, I gave notice of motion today to call the former Minister of Defense and former Member of Parliament, Jason Kenney, who was the Minister of Defense who first appointed General Vance to the position of Chief of Defense Staff. And we now know from many media reports that there were allegations of sexual misconduct at the time of his appointment or immediately thereafter. And so I believe, and that's why I have given notice of that motion, that in addition to the current Minister of Defense, it is essential that we hear from the former Minister of Defense who made that appointment. If we're going to give confidence to the Canadian military that all can serve equally, and in particular to women, they can serve in the Canadian military, we have to assure that this was taken seriously at the highest levels when these accusations were made. And as I said, on the face of it, I'm not sure that's true. That's why I support this motion to conduct these hearings. And that's why at this point, I am going to move the motion that I circulated and that is that Jason Kenney be called as an additional witness. So, Madam Chair, you can either treat that as an amendment to the motion before us or as a separate motion. It makes no difference to me. I believe we are in a different situation when it comes to these hearings than we are in our normal hearings where we ask each party to put forward witnesses. There are some witnesses here whose role in this have been essential and they must appear before the committee. It's not a matter of trading between parties. It's a matter of making sure we have the appropriate people to give the appropriate testimony so we can reestablish confidence that allegations of sexual misconduct and sexual harassment will always be taken with the utmost seriousness at the various highest levels in government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garrison. I acknowledge you moving your motion, but we have to put it aside first to deal with the current motion, the amended motion now. Madame Vandenbelt, did you have something you wanted to say?
No, I will speak on the motion when it's put.
Okay. All right. So we'll do another. Let's do another recorded division on the main motion. Then we'll do a recorded division on the main motion that has been amended. Anyone want that read out again? Yes, yes, please. We've had requests.
The main motion reads that the Standing Committee on National Defense begin an immediate study into the allegations of sexual misconduct on the part of retired General Jonathan Vance during and before his tenure as Chief of Defense Staff of the Canadian Armed Forces. That 3 meetings be held in public for no fewer than 2 hours each, that the meetings take place before February 26, 2021, that the following witness be called to testify individually before the committee: Honorable Harjit Sajjan, Minister of National Defense, and any other witnesses the committee deems necessary. That these meetings be televised and that the committee report its findings to the House. The question is on the main motion. Mr. Bagnall.
In favor.
Mr. Baker.
En faveur de la motion.
Madame Lalonde.
Pour la motion.
Mr. Spangeman.
Je vais pour la motion.
Ms. Vandenbelt.
In favor.
Mr. Benson.
In favor.
Mr. Bizan.
I vote yay in favor.
Mr. Dowdell.
In favor.
Ms. Gallant. Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe.
Pour.
Mr. Garrison.
In favor.
Motion carries. So, do we go right away to Mr. Garrison? Yes. Right. Garrison, do you wish to officially move your motion now?
Yes, I would like to move by motion that the committee invite former MP and former Minister of Defense Jason Kenney to appear and give evidence before this study in his role as the minister who first appointed General Vance to the position of Chief of Defense Staff, and in light of the fact that we now know that accusations of sexual misconduct and sexual harassment had already been made at the time of his appointment or thereabouts. Thank you.
All right, Madame Vandenbelt, and then Mr. Bazan. You're on mute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to reiterate just what we said before in terms of procedure and how we are going about selecting witnesses. I know, Madam Chair, that you have been very good in the past, that if there are priority witnesses that are sent in by any member of the committee, you have made sure that those witnesses are invited. So for those witnesses, for instance, the one that Mr. Garrison just asked for, presumably if that is his priority witness, that individual would be invited. I do caution a little bit about us getting into, starting to put names forward one by one. Now, having said that, I do note that Mr. Garrison did give notice ahead of the meeting about this particular witness. I would hope that if the Premier has information, or if any individual has information relevant to this, that they would cooperate with the relevant authorities, the CFNIS and others that are investigating. I think that there's no harm that if the committee were to extend an invitation to Premier Kenny. But even though I will be voting for this, I do want to put on record that I do believe it's a bad practice of the committee to discuss individual witnesses. Maybe not on this, but you can imagine in other cases where having your name discussed back and forth in a public forum could be very troubling for individual witnesses. So I just want to put that on record, that it not be a precedent. And the fact that Mr. Garrison did submit this ahead of time at least does give the members a chance to look at this. So I will be voting for it.
Go ahead.
Well, I guess there's no politics in that, and this is okay for Premier Kenny, but not all right for others. So with that in mind, and if we're going to be carrying forward on this motion, then I'd like to amend it by adding after thereafter, and start off with and also call the Deputy Clerk of the Privy Council, Christine Trombley, Deputy Minister of National Defence, Jody Thomas, Zita Astravis, Michael Warnick.
Yeah. Hmm? Yeah. So according to our glorious clerks, they know this inside and out, and they have to say that the decision has already been taken on that first one.
I would argue.
I know. I like Mr. Bazan. I'm not. I have really. I really dislike this. The way we're going through this.
Madam Chair, we do have a situation where the amendment that was passed could have been passed on two different fronts, not on one or the other. So it's not fair of the clerks, or procedurally correct in my mind, that they can just rule this as out of order since the decision was already taken. We voted on an amendment that was two parts, both on time and names. So with that said, I'm specializing this, and since we are dealing with a motion that is adding names of witnesses to appear before committee, I'm adding those witnesses that I just read onto the record.
I'm glad.
Madam Chair, I'm wondering why Mr. Garrison's motion is in order, given the amendments that were made to the main motion.
Even the main motion was in order. I never ruled it out of order. It was just a caution.
Amendments said no names. Now, Mr. Garrison introduced a name, so I just don't know from a procedural standpoint how you can have a motion that essentially says no names, then add another motion that adds a names.
I know.
Does it make sense?
It's not what I would like to see happen. I get it, but people just stand by for a minute. anybody else the committee deems appropriate. Like, so I do believe that the amended motion does leave room for what Mr. Garrison wants to see happen. It just doesn't name someone by name. So, no, like the amended main motion would allow to call the witness that Mr. Garrison wants to call. So, because it is any other witness the committee deems necessary. So I'm not sure we need this second motion, but it is a member's right to put a motion forward if they wish. So Madame Vanderbilt, then Mr. Garrison, and then Mr. Bazan.
So Madam Chair, just on a procedural note, I do believe that we have Mr. Garrison's motion, and that needs to be dealt with before another motion comes forward.
Mine's an amendment to the motion.
I know. Okay. All right. In that case, I just want to reiterate. I think that members who have one or two key priority witnesses, and I have some myself that I would like to submit, but I'm not going to be putting a whole slew of names forward in this forum. Members who have priorities, I think they will see those witnesses called. I do think that this is not a very good procedure to go by. Having said that, I think that we can go individually on these motions, but just to the point that Mr. Bazan made, I think that we should be doing the motions in a different forum, perhaps a steering committee meeting, so that we can discuss individual people's names, not in public. But it does not mean that the names that were mentioned previously by Mr. Bazan and others wouldn't be called as witnesses, because if they prioritize them, I would imagine they would get called. And so I don't think that all this discussion today is necessary, because we will be calling those witnesses anyway.
Mr. Bazan? Oh, Mr. Garrison. Yeah, I thought you weren't ready, so okay. Go ahead, Mr. Garrison, then Mr. Bazan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think we're dealing with something different here. I do agree with our normal procedure for selecting witnesses, but that's not the procedure we follow for inviting government officials and particularly ministers. And so my reason for naming the former Minister of Defense follows that precedent. We don't say that parties will decide whether or not we call the ministers responsible. So I think this is a different situation because Mr. Kenney is the former member of parliament and a former minister of defense. He's not a private individual. And I quite agree with the members who are arguing we normally do discuss witnesses in camera meeting. But when it comes to government officials and those who are or were responsible to parliament, I think that's a different category, and that's the reason I moved to separate motion. And I am supportive of Mr. Bazan's arguments that the same applies to those public servants who handle the vetting and complaints process. But as the chair's ruled, committee's decided that point. So I would urge committee members simply to support this motion to invite Premier Kennedy.
Okay, Mr. Bazan.
So I'll finalize it with this. Nobody else puts their hands up. This decision that we're talking about is a separate motion, separate decision. It's based upon naming witnesses for a committee study. Premier Kenney is no longer a parliamentarian, so he'd be appearing as an individual, so should be extended the same courtesy. In the vacancy of that, we need to then, if we're going
Point of order, Madam Chair. We cannot no longer hear Mr. Bazan.
All right, thank you. Stand by. You want to try that again, James? Give us a test.
Okay, testing 1, 2, 3.
Yep.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we lost
Okay.
you there, though. Okay.
Not sure what's happening here, but sorry about that. Where did you last year? I was just saying that since we're Minister Kenney or Premier Kenney is no longer a parliamentarian, so he is an individual that should be invited, not put into a motion like this. But if we're going to go down this route, and this is a separate decision from the decision we just previously took. One is based upon doing the study. This one here is based upon witness list. I believe that I am in order in bringing forward this motion to add the names that I just presented. And these are people, as Mr. Garrison just pointed out, that are definitely part of the complaints as well as the um, I guess the vetting process that took place and investigated the allegation. So we need to hear from them first before we even have the minister here, and that's why I think that needs to be part of this motion so that we can get the committee work started now and not wait till we have a steering committee and then determine who the witness list is and then schedule the meetings after that fact when we are working on a time frame now of February the 26th, though we've only got 2 weeks of meetings to make this happen. So, Madam Chair, I implore upon you to let's vote on this with the amendment.
All right. So putting forward an amendment to Mr. Garrison's motion. That is correct. So we'll be voting on that amendment first. And then after we vote on the amendment, then we'll be voting on the main motion. We good with that? Okay, stand by.
So, Madam Chair, just for clarification, we are now voting on Mr. Bazan's amendment right now?
Yes.
Is that the case?
That is correct. Stand by. All. Go ahead, Ms. Vanderbilt.
Yes, Madam Chair, just a question of procedure. If a witness is voted down in this committee, does that then preclude that witness from being able to be entertained if it comes forward as a witness from an individual member?
What she's asking is,
Because if that's the case, Madam Chair, I really think that this whole procedure that we're going through, where we're voting up and down different witnesses, is actually very unfair because what that will lead to is a number of witnesses that might be voted down because we just think procedurally it's incorrect, and in which case, if they were put forward by the member, those witnesses would likely be called. And I don't think that we are all in a position today to be saying yes, no to individual witnesses. I'd much prefer that parties submit those names and then leave it open for those witnesses to be able to be called.
the question is, if we were to vote, now, so yeah, thanks for making this an very interesting afternoon. I'm going to have to rule the suggested amendment out of order, and
And
there's
on that
nothing.
basis, Madam Chair, can you quote where in the standing orders or in the rules and procedures, third edition for the House of Commons?
If I could,
where
but there
that
is,
says that this would be out of order.
if I could, but there's nothing stopping the members from putting those names forward as witnesses. And we will do what we've always done, is that we will do our very best to get your priority witnesses. So there is some, it's not hard and fast perhaps, but I don't think it closes the door. If we were to either, we do not need to accept Mr. Garrison's motion in order to invite Mr. Kenny. We do not need to accept Mr. Bazan's original motions in order to invite the people that were on that list. But so it doesn't close any doors, right? But if we voted against something earlier, then I don't think we can go back and use those same names and that same again. So
At the same time, Madam Chair, that the motion was very clearly two parts in the previous motion. This is a separate motion that follows up on determining witness lists. We already have a motion that was tabled by Mr. Garrison that I've amended, and I believe is in order. So unless you can quote where in the standing orders or as it applies to committee, not to the House, but also in Chapter 20 of the Rules and Procedure of the House of Commons, third edition, where it says that this motion would be ruled out of order because of the decision previously took. We are masters of our own domain at committee, and so I would say that we should vote on it as we are in Mr. Garrison's motion. Unless Mr. Garrison is going to withdraw his motion, then the amendment is withdrawn as well.
go ahead, Mr. Spengman.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. You had mentioned earlier that on the advice of the clerk, this amendment would be out of order, and it had been dealt with previously. I'm suspecting that it's partly because Mr. Garrison's motion really is talking about an entirely different time frame. it's talking about then Minister of Defense Jason Kenney, who originally appointed General Vance, and then we have a run-on of names that were dealt with in a previous amendment that are chronologically completely out of step. So I'd like to hear, with your indulgence, Madam Chair, perhaps from the clerk, his thoughts as to why this is out of order.
Okay, just a second. We just.
Understand something in procedure. So are we talking about a study and two separate motions on witnesses, or are we talking about two separate studies? Because I just can't see how on the one side you can put into onto the paper that we're naming a witness, but then the other witnesses that another party wants to name are disallowed. I just don't see how they match. They're congruent. So if they're two separate studies, it would. But if they're all the same study, you can't give one party naming at this point and the other. What I don't understand why the second motion is in order if it's pertaining to the same study that we're going to do.
And Madame Gallant, thank you for that. And this is exactly why I do not like this practice of naming witnesses in motions, because it adds this additional layer of complexity to an issue that's already complex enough. So I don't disagree with what you're saying. It's trying to find that. I think that where we are now is that we'll be able to call whatever witnesses we want. We do not need them to be specified in the motion. And then when we do specify witnesses in the motion, this is where we end up. And then we end up when us evaluating each individual witness, pro and con, and it makes it really very difficult to do. So I'm not inclined to support motions. If it's in order, it's in order. If it's out of order, it's out of order. It's not quite clear here. I mean, it's the practice of the House kind of guides us. But I must admit to being reluctant to, if it's a valid motion, it's a valid motion, and we'll deal with it. But it's not what I don't want to see is this to encourage future behavior of this design of motions that we end up tied up in knots instead of being able to do it the way we've done it for the last few months. And I think we've done a good job. People have, in good faith, put witnesses forward, and in good faith, we went out and got them. So it's not pure, but it's definitely something that needs to be taken account. So I will let the clerk actually read what he was working on. Go ahead, clerk.
Chapter 12, under the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, under a decision once made must stand, reads, a decision once made cannot be questioned again, but must stand as the judgment of the House. Thus, for example, if a bill or motion is rejected, it cannot be revived in the same session, although there is no virtual motion similar in intent to one already negative, but with sufficient variance to constitute a new question. This is to prevent the time of the House being used in the discussion of motions of the same nature, with the possibility of contradictory decisions being arrived at in the course of the same session.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
I would just say that applies to the House, but not necessarily to committee. Committees are governed under Chapter 20.
Go ahead, Mr. Dowdell, and then Mr. Spengeman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to say that, sitting in this meeting here, the reason we get into a bit of trouble, whether it's here, whether it's the current government, is the fact of inconsistencies. And what I'm hearing here, and I know my colleagues, I've heard somebody say earlier today, something to the fact that they don't agree with it. We don't do it this way, but I would vote for it. Just doesn't bode well. So I would suggest to the chair, um, you know, they're very, very similar. They're very consistent. So I think as a committee, if we want to stay and be professional, I think that the onus is on us to make sure that we make a consistent call on this here, not base. So I think quite frankly, if Mr. Garrison's motion holds true, I don't know how you can, or how anyone, for that matter, can come to the consensus that some other party, no matter which party it is, brings somebody forward in the same way. So I just implore all the members here that consistency is the number one thing. I don't really see a big difference myself. And I believe what you're saying, Madam Chair, that if at any time any member wants to request somebody to come, I think all of us on this committee would do that. But I'm just concerned that if we're not following what we normally would consistently do, we may find ourselves in a little bit of a problem. So that would be my comment.
And then Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to repeat, I think we're talking about two very different things. Mr. Garrison's motion is about an entirely different time period. We had dealt with the witnesses that Mr. Bazan had put forward previously, and I would ask you, Madam Chair, on the advice of the clerk, to sustain the ruling that this amendment is out of order.
Is that correct?
That's only a decision that the chair can make.
Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, please. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think the same thing applies to Mr. Sajjan, and that's why I voted in favor of Anita's amendment. I think it was appropriate to name Mr. Sajjan as a witness. Now, regarding the procedures, I can't really say, but I want to say that I see a distinction between what James is saying and what Anita proposed earlier. Thank you very much, Mr. Brunel-Duceppe. Could you just
2-3 sentences maybe.
Donc, je disais,
Well, I was saying that Mr. Kenny is a former minister, and therefore he's has the same status as Mr. Saad.
choix de témoins.
So if we have witnesses that we would like, we should set priorities among them, and that everyone can give a priority list. So can you hear me now? The interpretation is working? Very good. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So just for some clarification, my understanding is, Madam Chair, that on the advice of the clerk, you've ruled Mr. Bazan's motion, or I guess amendment, out of order on the fact that it was already debated and voted on previously in this committee meeting. It's not because of the nature of the witnesses or the procedure or even my own objections to the procedure that we're undergoing today, which I think have shown for themselves why we don't do this. But because of a standing order, and I think, Madam Chair, that if that is your ruling, you should make that clear that that is your ruling, and then we can go on with other amendments or other motions as they come to the floor. I still think myself that this is not a good process, but the reason on Bazan's, Mr. Bazan's amendment is not because we disagree with it or we don't like the process. It's because it was already voted on. Thank you.
Exactly. And thank you for that. I'm trying to be as fair as possible, but here you can see the dangers in when we incorporate witness names inside the motion. So I do believe that I call it that the amendment to Mr. Garrison's motion put forward by Mr. Bazan is out of order. So so now we can go on and we can vote on Mr. Garrison's main motion. I call on the clerk to do a recorded division.
The question is on the main motion moved by Mr. Garrison. Mr. Bagnall.
In favor.
Mr. Baker.
En faveur.
Madame Lalonde.
Pour.
Mr. Spanchman.
In favor.
Ms. Van Belt.
In favor.
Mr. Benson.
Abstain.
Mr. Bizan.
Abstain.
Mr. Dowdell.
Abstain.
Ms. Gallant. Mr. Brunel Duceppe.
Pour la motion.
Mr. Garrison,
In favor?
The motion passes. Now, I just want to make it clear to everyone that this is exactly the reasons why I don't really think we need to include witness names in motions. I think we can discuss these things in a steering committee and come out with something that's very positive. This is a challenging thing to do, but remember the original motion put forward by Mr. Bazan includes any other witness the committee deems necessary. So go ahead, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I simply want to reiterate again that I do not believe this is the way we should deal with normal witnesses, and I moved a separate motion to invite Premier Kenney so that he's not being invited on a partisan basis as my witness to come to this committee, but as the former Minister of Defense who made the decision to hire a new Chief of Defense Staff who at the time was accused of serious sexual misconduct. So this is not an ordinary witness. It is not a procedure that I favor for ordinary witnesses. This is someone who was responsible to Parliament at the time, who remains a former minister, and that's why I think he deserves the courtesy of being invited by the committee as a whole and not being placed as an NDP witness, which is highly ironic. Thank you.
Okay. Madame Vandenbeld?
Yes, Madam Chair, will there be a deadline for us to submit our witness names?
For this new one, probably, what day is it, Tuesday? Wednesday? How about Wednesday evening? Because this is short order. Would that be acceptable to the committee? Witnesses' names into the clerk by close of business tomorrow, Wednesday. And then we will work with the IT people and to schedule these meetings, and we'll get back to you with what those options are. All right. Any further questions for today? All right. Meeting adjourned.